Hello you guys, and welcome back to my channel here at Prime Vanguard. In today's video we're going to be focusing on a bit of an underrated star now, but today's back profile is going to be on my favorite Granblue unit, Prison Necromancer Cocytus. So out of all the support that came from the most recent sets of the Remedy Labyrinth set that gave support to Granblue, Nightrose obviously being the main focus, has been the, main attraction and star, Granblue as you would call it. But for some dedicated players and some hardcore fans of certain cards, such as yours truly, they've been thinking in the lab and they've been coming up with some cool stuff. And I've already done my Nightrose deck profile. I'll make sure to leave that in the description below. But this was the one deck that I really wanted to put my thinking cap on. And I've looked at a lot of lists, you know me, I did my research, did my own little play testing, some Japanese deck lists, some English, questionnaires and stuff like that. And this is just a deck list that I came up to. So this is the deck list that I'm currently playing with right now. I'm having a lot of fun with it. It has as you already see here, it kind of has like a unique play style to it that allows you to take advantage of both Protect 1 and 2. But we'll get into that later. I think the most important thing we need to do right now is hop right onto this deck profile, which is what we're going to do onto the next slide. So to start this deck profile off, of course we're playing 4 copies of Prison Necromancer Cocytus. So I just want to make it very clear, Cocytus, still a really amazing card. This card did not go bad simply because Nightrose got good. Let's make that very clear. There's even some Japanese deck lists that use Cocytus as the finisher or the kickstarter of the deck because it's still really amazing for what it does. For those of you that need a refresher course or that do not know what Prison Necromancer Cocytus does, he has 2 effects, both are on the Vanguard. His first ability is you get to counterblast 1, mill 4 cards from the top of your deck, and then call up to 2 units from your drop zone, and then per every grade 3 that you have in the soul, you get to call an additional unit to that. So if you have 2 grade 3s in the soul, you call 3. If you have 2 grade 3s in the soul, you get to call 4. So this card sets up boards by himself, helps you mill by yourself, set up your drop zone all by himself. This card essentially does everything that the deck needs to do all by himself. And his second ability helps you lead into that and rewards you for going into later play, which is the first ability that he has, which is during your turn, if your drop zone has 10 or more cards, he gets 10,000 power. Not bad, so that this way he becomes a beat stick by himself. And then the second ability is if you have 20 or more cards, he gets 20k power and +1 critical instead of the 10,000. So this card stacks by himself and he rewards himself for the longer game that you play. And the unique thing about this card is that the first ability is good by itself as it becomes 32 +1 critical, and then the second ability just helps you lead up into the first ability. So this card by itself is extremely self-sufficient as we don't need to rely on other pieces that we have in the deck to get to this 20k number, as if we were just relying on Cocytus for all of our milling, which we're not of course because we're a good player, we can think for ourselves, then we can rely on Cocytus to get to that. But with other cards that we have in the deck leading us to that strategy, it's still really amazing. Cocytus didn't stop being bad just because Nightrose got good. Cocytus, you just have to, again, the same thing that I made with my Dontarian deck, you have to know your matchups with this card, but with the way that we play this deck, we have different win cons as well. So Cocytus is the star of the deck though, and you'll see the card choices I made just to emphasize on that. For our next grade 3, we play 3 copies of Vampire Princess of Nightfog Nightrose. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You guys probably think I'm a hypocrite because I said Cocytus didn't get bad just because Nightrose got good, but hear me out. So if that's how we truly feel, then it's either Nightrose or Basskirk. And Basskirk, he's not a terrible card, but he's been outclassed by everything else that came out. And obviously when building this deck, whenever I build one of these decks that feature the underdog of the set or the card that isn't like the main highlight, I'm really building this deck, guys, to be the most competitive variation that I can. And Nightrose is just really one of the best grade 3 Vanguards that Granblue has. So if we ever got to a situation with Cocytus where we mill too much or we need to apply more pressure and the extra criticals isn't getting it done and our opponent has a big hand and multiple attacks is needed, Nightrose comes in. There have been games, one of the main problems that Cocytus has always had was that if you ever, in order to get that board off, you need to mill forward Cocytus. That's not optional. But going to a card like Nightrose that can take advantage of all that milling that you do, like I said in my last video, is helpful. So I'm not going to go too deep in Nightrose. If you really want to figure out my thoughts on Nightrose, go ahead and watch my last video. Like I said, it'll be in the link description below. But all I will say is that she is our very best. She's one of our other finishers. She's our other win con, and she can also be our very best first Vanguard, as the deck does have early game milling options, so you can still take advantage of her. But she's just not the focus of the deck. That's why she's only being played as 3 of as Cocytus is. But again, she just plays a big role in Granblue, as she just is one of the best Vanguards that Granblue has, because Baz Kirk has just been outclassed by everything else. For our next grade 3, we play 2 copies of Dragon Undead Skull Dragon. Dragon Undead Skull Dragon, the best beat stick that Granblue has, and combined with Cocytus, because of the aggressive milling that you do with Cocytus, this card reaches absurd numbers really fast. And in Cocytus, I think it does better simply because Cocytus gets a crit by himself, and with the cards that we play and the way that we play the deck, and the extra criticals that we have in this deck, this card just becomes unstoppable by itself and almost always demands a perfect guard from your opponent. And with Cocytus doing what it does, he just gets really fat really fast, and he plays more of a role in this deck than I would even say Nightrose. But 2 in this deck is still a really comfortable number, as we have other cards in the deck that will essentially allow us to, you know, get rid of this card or get this card whenever we so desire. Moving on to our grade 2s, we play 4 copies of Greed Shade. Like I said in my last Nightrose video, this is still one of the best cards that Granblue has. He does so much work, especially in a deck like this, where we have the aggressive milling with Cocytus, so we're always allowing ourselves to see more of our deck and get whatever card that we want, essentially, so that we can, you know, build up our hand, build up our board, do whatever it is that we need to do. Greed Shade overall just works really, really well in this deck, and essentially says, discard 1, search my deck for any card that I want. And in Cocytus, it just does better as it gives us more utility. For our next grade 2, Pirate Swordsman Colombard, essentially the best grade 2 in all of standard Vanguard. This card literally says counterblast 1, search my deck, put anything I want on the board, or pretty much counterblast 1, search my deck, and do anything that I want, as it calls out whatever you put in the drop zone, for that's what his ability is. And since it's Vanguard and Rearguard Circle, it works out really well, as it's helped us also set up our drop zone if we need anything peculiar or particular for what we have in our deck. So 4 copies of Pirate Swordsman Colombard is a must. I don't think there's much debate on this card, and he's just a very key piece in making sure that our Cocytus strategy for the deck is efficient as possible. For our next grade 2, I play 2 copies of Storm Ride Ghost Ship. Okay, so we play 2 copies of Storm Ride Ghost Ship, and he has a bit of a more important role in this deck, as unlike in Nightrose, you essentially don't have the extra attacks. You want really thick and big attacks in this deck, so having those stronger columns and getting that extra draw power is important in Cocytus, as that'll help you lead into your strategy. As Cocytus, especially the way he works, you want more of a stronger early game defense than you do in Nightrose, whereas Nightrose is more lenient because they want the counterblast to their skills, where really you rely on Cocytus to do everything. Just everything else feeds off what Cocytus does, as that was the main purpose and point of me while I was building this deck. So Storm Rider Ghost Ship, he becomes 24k on his own, and he lets you draw a card, so you can combine this with Colombard, or you can set this card up later with your Greed Shades for discard whatever it is that you need it to be, or Negro Bone, so that you can essentially call this card back to get that card draw. So that's what this card is for. It helps us set up for our plays and gives us more card advantage, and it plays a bigger role in Cocytus than it does in Nightrose. So that's why he's up to 2 in this deck. Moving on to our grade 1s. So we play an Old Face, which is 4 copies of Dandy Guy Romario. So Dandy Guy Romario is back in the deck, and for those of you that do not know what he does, he has 2 abilities. His really important one is when he's rode upon, you get to counterblast 1, Pick a card from your hand, move it into the soul, and then you get to mill 3 cards from your deck and then take one of those cards, add it to your hand. His second ability is if you have 10 or more cards in your drop zone, he gets 4,000 power. So we really want this card for the first ability. This will help us set up our soul so that this way when we go into our Cocytus, we can really start building up our board. And he also helps us get rid of those pieces in our hand that can't be ridden or can't be called, as they're not doing anything, so why not throw them into the soul so that we can get them out later with our Ripple Banshee that we play in the deck. Romario plays a more key strategy in Cocytus, as Cocytus gets more calls the more grade 3s that you have in the soul. That's why the grade 3 count in this Granblue deck is up to 9 versus Nightrose where it was at 7, because we want to see more grade 3s that we can, throw them into our soul, so that this way when we go to Cocytus, we can call up to 3 cards and build up our board and start hitting our opponent like that, or just manipulating our drop zone faster. But this way it's not a waste and we're not just calling out triggers or anything messy like that. So Romario, key piece for Cocytus. And there wasn't a need for Tommy, as I don't really care about the grade 3s. Whether I go into Nightrose or Cocytus is really good. So Romario, yeah, he just helps us set up our drop zone and he helps us get that early game mill. This way I don't have to play a card like Skeleton Sea Navigator, so I'm not milling my deck out too fast for when I go into Cocytus. So Romario, he's back in the deck and he's still really amazing as ever. I'm happy to be playing this card again. For our next grade 1, we play 4 copies of Witch Doctor of the Powdered Bone, Negro Bone. Still a really amazing card, probably the best grade 1 other than Romario that we have in this deck. This card is just amazing in the sense that it works in the drop zone, and because of how much Cocytus mills, you have a high chance of seeing this card even faster than you would in Nightrose with Navigator. But Negro Bone, for those of you that don't know what he does, he's a drop zone effect where you get to discard a card from your hand and put him to the bottom of the deck and call a grade 1 unit from your drop zone to rear guard. And if you have 10 or more cards, you get to call anything else that you want from your drop zone instead. So with Negro Bone in this deck, you essentially always get to that 10 card drop zone. So you're always essentially getting to call it whatever you want. And because we mill so much, we're essentially relying on our drop zone to be our second hand so that we can call stuff out from our drop zone more efficiently without having to use our hand when we attack. And unlike Nightrose in this deck, a lot of our rear guards don't retire, so we end up superior calling over them so that we can get those other units back in the drop zone so that we can do that. But it's more efficient in this sense because we have cards like Negro Bone and the other card that I'm about to show you in the deck that we can call over so that we can effectively call those units back again to recycle them, but this way without touching our hand so that we can stay a fat hand and not affecting our deck so much when we use Cocytus. So having this card to essentially recycle stuff back onto the board from our hand into the drop zone and into the deck is really helpful to have as well. For our next grade 1, we play 4 copies of Dancing Cutlass. So as I made my statement about Negro Bone, this is the other grade 1 that we want to play. Although Counterblast in this particular variation of the deck isn't so much of an issue, having Dancing Cutlass, who is another card that essentially activates while in the drop zone, is amazing to have. For those of you who do not know what Dancing Cutlass does, he has the ability where you bind a copy of himself from the drop zone and then you call it out, you get to countercharge 1 and mill 1 from the top of your deck. So this card essentially replaces itself so that this way our drop zone stays at the number that whatever we need it to be needs to, and then we get the countercharge. So it's overall a free +1, and the power so much isn't a bother, but we really just want it for the counter charge and the fact that it is a drop zone ability and we can call it out so that this way we're not relying again on our hand to call our pieces out, as we are so much relying on our drop zone to do so. Because Cocytus will create us a board, but everything on that board will stay unless it has an effect that retires itself. So having Cutlass to get the other units that we want back in the drop zone without touching our hand is really amazing to have, which is the main reason why we play it. Or if we need to alternate into our Nightrose strategy, then Cutlass comes in and steps into the game. And then for our next grade 1, we play 2 copies of Ripple Banshee. So Ripple Banshee, this is the card that we can use to help us get anything out we want from our soul for some extra draw power, and she gets extra power as well. So this also goes well with our Storm Rider Ghost Ship strategy or any setup strategy that we have, as Cocytus makes his calls during the main phase. So if we want to turbo out to the 20 card soul, we can do that, and this card just helps us do it, as we can take any piece we want from our soul that we want to call with Cocytus and get it into the drop zone. Having this card is essential into the deck. It's the other key card advantage booster we want. However, I will say that Out of all the slots in this deck, this is the most flexible one, as yeah, the extra card draw is important, but if we want to, we can play anything else that we want. You can honestly drop this down to 1 to play something else, or if you're not feeling it, you can also say that the Cutlass cards, you can take them out to play something else as well. That's the cool thing about Cocytus, is that because of the way he works, you can essentially play the deck any way you want with any variety of cards, because you do so much milling and calling that it's okay. So, but for me, I like to stay safe, and 2 Banshees was enough for me. Moving on to our triggers, we play 4 copies of Rampage Shade, 4 copies of Night Spirit, 4 copies of Rough Seas Banshee, and then for old time's sake, we play 4 copies of Rick the Ghosty. So this was my trigger lineup for the deck. I feel like with Cocytus, it's more important to go criticals. There's no reason for me to play that grade 1 old ghosty thing. We have Romario, and the deck is so much more efficient now with the support that we have than before. So 12 crit is more important in this deck as well, as because of the aggressive milling, you especially don't want draw triggers, because then you'll deck yourself out. So 12 crit, and with the Sentinel crit that we can get back with our Great Shade if we need to, is important to have. But thanks to all these cards and the way that it works, I'm very comfortable with this trigger lineup. I feel like this is really just a set trigger lineup you need to play, especially in Cocytus. So that's how I feel about it. So this is what I have set up for the deck for Cocytus. Finally, for our starter, this time we're playing Captain Nightkid. Back when Cocytus first came out, Captain Nightkid was the starter you had, so for old time's sake, Captain Nightkid has to be the starter that we have for this deck. Okay, you guys, and now this time I finally want to talk about the markers. So in this deck, like I was saying, unlike every other variation of the deck that we had played, this variation of the deck focuses on Cocytus more. So because that is so, you have more flexibility of playing Protect 2 or Protect 1 if you want, because the cards that Cocytus calls don't leave the field. And really, because Cocytus gets his own crit and you're already playing a 12 crit deck with essentially more effective milling and sorts like that, Protect 2 isn't as bad. You can honestly build up a fat hand in this deck simply because you're not ever using your hand to call out. And if you are using your hand to call out, that's only because your opponent is kind of like figuring out what your strategy is, or they now know that you're focusing Cocytus versus Nightrose, so they have to essentially focus their strategy differently. But Cocytus having the critical and doing the extra calls in rear guard goes well with Protect 2, as the units that we call in the front row usually will stay, unless we're going for those beatdown turns with our Undead Dragon Skull Dragons, which is usually 8 times out of 10. But in the times that we don't get our undead Skull Dragons, then we can go ahead and just throw it on Protect 2, and the extra power isn't bad or anything that I regret either. So overall, that's just the little note I wanted to make about the deck. I feel like, you know, saying Protect 2 doesn't exist is bad, because you have to acknowledge the Protect 2's existence, especially in this deck. Sometimes it comes up, sometimes it doesn't. It just means that you're focusing one aggressive strategy whenever you drop this card. So it is very important to note that if you're going to play Protect 2, you better play aggressive, not defensive. But that is all for today's deck profile, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I definitely was really excited to make this video. I want to try something unique, and I wanted to focus purely on Cocytus, so that's why the deck was built like this. If you enjoy seeing more videos like this, please go ahead and let me know down in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. I have plenty of more stuff coming up. Also, if your friend's thinking about building their own variation of Cocytus, or thinking about building Cocytus, again, go ahead and use this deck profile as a guideline, so definitely share this video with them on all platforms. I have my own Instagram now set up in my channel link, so definitely go ahead and follow my Instagram if you want to link this video to that or share this with them. And yeah, that's what everything's going on right now. We are also officially the Prime Vanguard channel. Well, not we, I am officially the Prime Vanguard channel. KP Kingdom is not dead, but I am rebranding. So definitely, like I said, go ahead, like, comment, subscribe, and I will see y'all soon, guys. But bye.